In the quiet streets of Kaduna, Nigeria, a dark story lurked beneath a facade of respectability. On a warm April morning, the police found a woman dead in her home, her body marked with signs of violence. Investigators quickly learned this was no ordinary case. The victim was enmeshed in a twisted web of secrets, lust, and betrayal that would ultimately shatter her family. What they would soon uncover would leave the community reeling. In 2008, in the bustling city of Kaduna, Nigeria, Zainab found herself fighting an invisible battle that most people around her never noticed. Zainab was a quiet woman, a mother, and a deeply religious wife. She was 35 years old, with gentle eyes that seemed to carry years of wisdom and patience, and she had devoted most of her adult life to her family. She had always been there for her two children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 7, guiding them with the love and discipline she herself was raised with. Her husband, Ahmed, was a few years older, now in his early 40s. He had once been the pride of his family, a man with ambitious dreams and a desire to make a name for himself. But over the years, life had worn him down. Ahmed ran a small business that sold building supplies, a business he'd inherited from his father, who had once thrived in the same trade. However, the economy had shifted, and in recent years, things had taken a turn for the worse. A lack of consistent customers, increasing competition, and the challenges of managing a business with outdated methods had driven Ahmed into deep financial strain. The family's debts grew silently but steadily, casting a shadow over their lives. As months went by, Zainab felt the weight of their financial problems more acutely. Every day, she carefully counted their expenses, stretching every naira to provide for the children. The family once had modest savings, but over time, those savings dwindled, vanishing into unpaid bills, school fees, and medical expenses. Zainab rarely voiced her fears. Instead, she prayed and hoped for some miracle, some relief that would allow her family to breathe again. It was during this period that Faisal, Ahmed's younger brother, often visited. Faisal was everything Ahmed was not: young, wealthy, and single. He was in his late 20s, a handsome man with a charisma that made him the center of attention wherever he went. Faisal had ventured into business early on and found success where others had failed. His ventures in real estate and import businesses brought him a luxurious lifestyle, filled with the kind of comforts that seemed out of reach for Ahmed and Zainab. Faisal drove expensive cars, dressed in designer clothes, and seemed to live with an ease that Zainab's family could only dream of. Faisal's visits were frequent, and he came bearing gifts for his brother's children, often surprising them with new toys, sweets, and even cash. The children adored their uncle, unaware of the growing tension his presence caused between their parents. Faisal's generosity was a double-edged sword for Zainab. She appreciated his kindness toward her children, but each visit reminded her of their own struggles, contrasting sharply with the wealth Faisal possessed. Despite this, she kept her feelings to herself, maintaining a quiet composure. Ahmed's resentment towards his brother's success simmered, although he tried to keep it hidden. The siblings had been close in their youth, but time had taken them on vastly different paths. Where Ahmed had stumbled and struggled, Faisal seemed to rise effortlessly. Ahmed couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness, a constant reminder of his own inadequacies and failures. In the February 2010, the strain reached a breaking point. Ahmed had received a notice of foreclosure on their modest home, a property that had been in his family for generations. Losing the house would be the ultimate humiliation, a failure that he feared would brand him in the community forever. He knew he had no way to pay the amount owed, but he couldn't bring himself to share the news with Zainab. Instead, Ahmed spent sleepless nights obsessing over his brother's wealth, wondering if there was a way to bridge his family's desperation with Faisal's affluence. Late one night, after much internal struggle, Ahmed made a decision. He approached Zainab, bringing up the idea in vague terms, presenting it as a way to save their family. He suggested that if she could spend some time with Faisal, it might persuade him to help them financially. He mentioned the sacrifices a mother must make for her children, the duty of a wife to her husband, framing it all as a painful but necessary choice. Zainab was horrified, yet her response was muted. She was shocked by the request, struggling to comprehend that the man she had trusted and loved for so long would ask this of her. But Ahmed, in his desperation, saw no other way, and over the next few days he continued to press her. Each time, he reminded her of their financial predicament, the debt that threatened their home, and the impact it would have on their children. He told her that Faisal might respond to persuasion, and emphasized the duty she owed to protect her family's future. The pressure mounted until Zainab felt her resolve weakening. She had sacrificed so much already, and now she felt as though she was being asked to sacrifice herself. Her mind filled with images of her children and the life they would face without a home or stability. For a woman whose identity was so deeply intertwined with her role as a mother and a wife, the decision became a silent burden. She bore alone, her inner turmoil hidden from everyone. In March 2010, Zainab yielded to Ahmed's request, agreeing to go through with the arrangement. Her days passed in a daze, her mind a whirl of emotions. She met Faisal with a numb acceptance, treating their time together as a formality, a transaction with the sole purpose of saving her family. Faisal, unaware of Ahmed's involvement, was captivated by Zainab's beauty and grace. Her quiet strength and humility attracted him, and he soon began to see her in a different light, though he never questioned why she had suddenly shown interest in him. By April, Faisal began providing the financial support that Ahmed had hoped for, sending money discreetly to help them settle their debts. But the arrangement that was supposed to be a temporary fix started taking on a life of its own. Zainab found herself conflicted. Faisal's attention was a stark contrast to the years of neglect she had endured in her marriage. The passion and warmth he offered began to erode the boundaries she had set for herself, and her emotions, once purely dutiful, shifted into a confusing blend of guilt and desire. As the months went on, Zainab's attachment to Faisal grew. She felt trapped in a double life, haunted by her actions, yet unable to break free. In time, she started meeting Faisal of her own accord, without Ahmed's knowledge or permission. The arrangement had shifted beyond anything Ahmed could control, planting the seeds of betrayal that would soon tear their family apart. By early 2011, the family's finances seemed to stabilize, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that would leave a tragic and irreversible impact on all of them. By mid-2011, what began as a sacrifice for her family's welfare became an unspoken connection that Zainab could no longer deny. The once awkward encounters with Faisal began to shift. At first, Zainab had endured these meetings, moving mechanically through moments that she had agreed to reluctantly, all for the sake of her family's survival. She would arrive at his apartment or meet him in the quiet hours of the evening, her heart heavy with the knowledge of her betrayal. Yet, with each passing week, a subtle transformation took hold. Faisal's presence became more than just a necessity. He was attentive, offering Zainab warmth and understanding in ways that Ahmed never had. Faisal noticed things that had gone ignored in her marriage, the small details of her personality, the hidden depths of her intelligence, the silent struggles she carried. To Faisal, Zainab was not just Ahmed's wife, or the mother of two. She was a complex woman who fascinated him. He showed her kindness, often speaking softly and thoughtfully about her hopes and fears. In his presence, Zainab began to feel valued as a woman, in ways she had long forgotten. As the months went by, Zainab found herself drawn to Faisal with an intensity that both frightened and thrilled her. Every encounter left her feeling exhilarated, a welcome escape from the life of sacrifices and obligations she had grown accustomed to. She felt alive in his company, shedding the weight of her responsibilities, if only for a few fleeting hours. For years, Zainab had known only the role of wife and mother, bound by the cultural expectations placed on her. Now, in these private moments with Faisal, she experienced a freedom that filled her with both guilt and longing. She felt herself drifting away from the principles that had once guided her life. By the end of 2011, Zainab's attachment to Faisal had grown deeper, the boundaries of their arrangement blurring as she willingly sought his company, sometimes even outside the confines of Ahmed's knowledge. Zainab would invent small errands, or pretend to visit friends just to steal a few hours with Faisal. Each rendezvous felt like an escape, a world away from the judgment and expectations that awaited her at home. Faisal's home became a sanctuary, a place where she could leave her burdens at the door and allow herself to feel cherished. Yet, as much as she longed to be with Faisal, Zainab was tormented by a deepening inner conflict. She felt herself slipping away from the woman she once was, replaced by someone she scarcely recognized. Her faith, her loyalty to her husband, her role as a mother, each of these pillars of her life was now tainted by guilt. She prayed fervently for forgiveness, but each time she returned to Faisal, she felt herself entangled in the threads of a web she had woven herself. Her guilt was matched only by her desire, and together they became a prison from which she saw no escape. Meanwhile, Ahmed began to sense the subtle changes in his wife. At first, it was the small things, her distracted glances, her prolonged absences, the unfamiliar lightness in her step. By early 2012, Ahmed's suspicions grew as Zainab seemed distant, her thoughts seemingly elsewhere. He noticed that she took more care in her appearance, her demeanor more vibrant than it had been in years. The once quiet, weary woman he had known now carried an air of mystery, as if she were hiding something just beneath the surface. One evening, Ahmed quietly voiced his concerns, asking if everything was all right. Zainab assured him, offering vague explanations about errands and friends. Yet, her avoidance only fueled Ahmed's growing unease. Inwardly, he wrestled with the painful realization that Zainab's interactions with Faisal had crossed the boundaries of their agreement. What he had initiated as a necessary arrangement now felt like a betrayal. Ahmed's emotions twisted into a turbulent mix of jealousy, resentment, and guilt, haunting him in the quiet hours of the night. Ahmed felt disgusted by his own role in what had transpired. He began to recall the look in her eyes when he first suggested the arrangement, how she had looked away, her face marked with pain and shame. He had brushed it aside then, but now, seeing her drift further away from him, the memory of that moment haunted him. What once seemed like a solution to their struggles now felt like the catalyst for his deepest humiliation. Each time he thought of her in Faisal's arms, he was consumed by bitterness. The resentment simmered, hidden beneath the surface, creating a tension that thickened with each passing day. Ahmed found himself constantly on edge, watching Zainab's every movement, searching for signs of her betrayal. His mind raced with questions, wondering how often she was with Faisal, wondering what his younger, wealthier brother could offer her that he could not. The shame of knowing he had brought this upon himself clashed with his desire to confront her. He felt trapped, paralyzed by the knowledge that he was both the instigator and the victim of his own plan. As the weeks wore on, Ahmed's suspicions turned to resentment toward Faisal. The brother he had once admired now seemed like a cruel mirror, a reflection of all that Ahmed wished he could be, but had failed to become. Faisal's success, his wealth, and now his apparent influence over Zainab were daggers that cut into Ahmed's pride. He saw Faisal's presence not only as a threat to his marriage, but as a reminder of his own inadequacies. The brothers no longer spoke with the warmth they once shared, their interactions reduced to strained pleasantries. By mid-2012, Ahmed's mind was in turmoil. The once clear boundary between sacrifice and betrayal had dissolved, replaced by a festering wound that grew deeper each day. He avoided confrontation, choosing instead to monitor Zainab in silence, hoping that somehow the truth would reveal itself. The tension in their home became almost unbearable, each interaction laced with suspicion and unspoken resentment. Yet despite the growing rift, Zainab remained unaware of the extent of Ahmed's suspicions. She continued her meetings with Faisal, wrapped in a fog of denial and desire, trying to keep the two worlds of her life separate. But beneath her composed exterior, she felt the fragile threads of her existence beginning to unravel. The guilt that weighed upon her was a constant reminder of the life she was endangering. But each time she tried to pull away, the allure of Faisal's world drew her back. As the summer months drifted by, the delicate web of secrets and lies grew tighter around them all. The bond that had once been meant to save the family was now tearing it apart, setting the stage for a confrontation that none of them could escape. Each of them was entangled in a cycle of desire, guilt, and resentment, bound together by choices they could no longer undo. Their fates, once so carefully controlled, now spiraled toward an inevitable reckoning. By the evening of February 28th, the air in Ahmed and Zainab's home was thick with unspoken accusations. Months of silent resentment, creeping jealousy, and growing mistrust had built up to a point of no return. Ahmed could no longer bear the weight of his suspicions. That night, unable to restrain himself any longer, he confronted Zainab, his voice low and tense, but brimming with rage. In the dim light of their small living room, Ahmed accused Zainab of betraying him and defiling their family's honor. He spoke coldly, each word dripping with disdain and bitterness. Zainab stood frozen, stunned by the intensity of Ahmed's anger. She felt her own shame rise to the surface, mingling with fear. For the first time, she saw in her husband's eyes the hurt and humiliation her actions had caused. She felt the full weight of her choices pressing down on her, and her silence only deepened Ahmed's rage. As Ahmed's accusations escalated, the confrontation spiraled out of control. Years of buried resentment, wounded pride, and shattered trust boiled over, exploding in a violent fury. In a moment of blind rage, Ahmed struck out at Zainab. His fists, fueled by the anger and humiliation he had suppressed, connected again and again, releasing months of pain. Zainab's cries filled the room, but were soon replaced by silence as her strength faded. In a moment, Ahmed's fury turned fatal, leaving Zainab's lifeless body lying before him. As the rage that had overtaken him subsided, the room fell eerily silent. Ahmed found himself staring down at the woman he had once loved, her still form marked by his violence. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, slowly at first, then all at once. He felt his heart pound as he knelt beside her, the horror of his actions freezing him in place. He reached out, but the warmth had already left her body. In that instant, Ahmed understood the finality of what he had done, and a wave of remorse washed over him, paralyzing him with guilt. Ahmed's mind spiraled, replaying the events that had led him to this point, but the memory of his actions was too painful to bear. He stumbled to his feet, his gaze fixed on Zainab's lifeless form, and then, as if gripped by an instinct to escape, he fled the scene. The weight of his guilt followed him as he ran into the night, his heart pounding with the knowledge that he could never undo what he had just done. 2 days later, on March 1st, local authorities responded to a concerned neighbor's report that no one had seen Zainab for days. Arriving at the modest home, they were met with a grim scene. Inside, Zainab's body lay cold and lifeless, her injuries a clear indication of a violent attack, a crime of passion, one that pointed directly to someone close to her. Investigators surveyed the scene, noting the intensity of the injuries, the rage that had been inflicted upon her. There was no sign of forced entry or robbery. Instead, everything about the scene suggested an intimate violence, a brutality born from betrayal. The police quickly turned their attention to Ahmed. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices and a loud, sudden silence on the night of February 28th, and Ahmed's absence in the days that followed only increased their suspicions. Those who had seen him recently described his erratic, haunted demeanor, as if he were a man grappling with a terrible secret. By March 3rd, Ahmed's name was at the center of the investigation, as police began piecing together evidence that pointed toward him as the prime suspect. Meanwhile, whispers of Zainab's affair with Faisal began to surface. The affair, which had been hidden from most of the community, became the focus of gossip, spreading quickly and igniting a mix of shock and outrage. Faisal, a man of influence and wealth, managed to keep himself distanced from the police investigation. His connections in the community ensured that his name was mentioned only in hushed tones, protecting him from public scrutiny. Despite his involvement in the scandal, Faisal remained untouchable, shielded by his status. The community's frustrations simmered, as many believed he bore a responsibility for Zainab's death, even if he was not directly involved. By the March 8th, the police had collected enough evidence to arrest Ahmed. In a moment of resignation, Ahmed confessed to the murder, recounting the events of that fateful night and the emotions that had driven him to such an irreversible act. He spoke of his humiliation and anger, how the discovery of Zainab's betrayal with Faisal had pushed him to a breaking point. Ahmed's confession was a mixture of sorrow and bitter resentment, a twisted blend of love and hate. He revealed his own role in arranging the initial encounters, admitting that desperation had driven him to make choices that now haunted him. The town was gripped by the details of Ahmed's confession. Some pitied him, seeing a man who had been betrayed by his brother and his wife, a man who had lost everything and been pushed beyond his limits. Others condemned him, unable to forgive the brutal act of violence he had committed. As his confession circulated, the community grappled with the complexity of the story. How a family's financial desperation, misplaced loyalty, and human weakness had led to such a tragic end. Ahmed's admission brought a somber sense of closure to the investigation, but it also left the community questioning the nature of justice. Faisal, despite his involvement in Zainab's downfall, remained protected, untouched by the consequences of the affair. His wealth and influence shielded him from any public reckoning, and although rumors followed him, he continued with his life as if unaffected. For many in the community, Faisal's impunity was a painful reminder of the privileges wealth could buy, deepening the resentment and anger among those who felt he had escaped justice. In the days that followed, the story of Zainab's death spread throughout the community. igniting a mix of sorrow, anger, and betrayal. The townspeople struggled to reconcile the image of Ahmed, the husband and father they had once known, with the man who had been driven to such desperate violence. And while Ahmed awaited the consequences of his confession, Faisal's silence cast a shadow over the truth, leaving questions unanswered and the community forever changed by the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. The trial begins on March 20th. In court, the prosecution paints a vivid picture of the betrayal, manipulation, and hidden passion that led to Zainab's death. Faisal's name is mentioned, but his wealth shields him from facing any consequences. Ahmed is sentenced to death on the April 15th, leaving his family and community divided between justice and sorrow. Faisal remains free, haunted by guilt, and estranged from his family. The town views him with a mixture of fascination and scorn, but his connections protect him from any real punishment. Zainab's children, left parentless, are taken in by relatives, while rumors of the scandal linger for years as a chilling reminder of secrets that lurk beneath the surface. In the years that follow, the community can't shake the memory of Zainab's tragic end. The story becomes a cautionary tale of how desperation can lead to devastating choices, and how secrets, once unearthed, can destroy even the closest families. This is very similar to the case where a wife's forbidden affair with her Muslim neighbor ended in murder. This tragedy, like the one you just watched, could have been avoided if everyone had taken some time to think of the best course of action instead of straight up